Hello, Benjamin Davidson. Welcome to the Elite Ball Knowledge Podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about like some of your beliefs, philosophical beliefs.
Yes, so I grew up in Long Island and I grew up in a Jewish household. I went to a Jewish day school for until about sixth grade, and um, I enjoyed it. I would say it was definitely good. A lot of good experiences. Of course, we learned other stuff too, like what you would learn in normal school, but we also learned like how to speak Hebrew or which is like the first part of the Bible. So it was really good. And then I switched over to public school. I still went to temple on like the holy holidays, and we celebrate Shabbat even still. And then as I grew up, I don't necessarily have anything against it. I just feel like I just don't really believe in God anymore. And I don't think it's a bad thing if you do, but I don't feel like it's correct. And at times it could be a bit like I could be a bit envious of people who do, but it's not like you could do anything to change it. Because if you don't believe something, you can't just automatically change it.
For sure. Was there a particular moment when you realized like, oh wait, God isn't real? Or like, has it just been a slow or just something that was intuitive to you or what?
I can't pinpoint a specific moment, but I do know that it wasn't I don't think it was a specific moment, like when you discovered the tooth fairy is not real because your older sibling told you. It was more like I guess I was slowly drifting away for whatever reason, and then maybe somebody asked me about it or I thought about it and I was like, "Huh, I guess I really don't believe in it."
What do you think is the most convincing argument against like God's existence?
It's probably the problem of evil. If you're talking about like the Christianity, Judaism, because when you're talking about a all perfect God, all powerful, I like acknowledge that for other religions that and even religions that like I wouldn't even know about, it probably doesn't work as an argument. But definitely that's probably the most convincing for me and definitely the most convincing for a lot of other people.
What about it, I guess, is so convincing? Like what and for the people that don't know, what is the problem of evil?
Sure. So the problem of evil pretty much says if you have this all good, all powerful God, why would he allow bad things to go on? Very simply, that's what it's saying. And it's more complex than that, but at face value, you could kind of tell where it's coming from. And I think that what's so powerful about it is one, it's so simple, especially like I said, with what I just said, everyone's able to understand it no matter who you are. And the good thing about that is it also affects people on an emotional level too, because you could apply your personal experiences to it. You see people losing their lives, maybe even a close one to diseases or cancer that seem like, especially with stuff like that, there seem like there's no benefit to that. Because there are times where it could be like, sure, you have to work out in the gym and it hurts, but you get stronger. But then you see like a child being born prematurely for no reason. And now you're kind of like, the child didn't do anything to deserve it and nothing good's going to come out of it. So I think that's really what gets people. And that's what makes it so powerful.
And what do you think is the best argument for the existence of God?
That's a good question. I think that the best argument is probably, and it not necessarily for like this Judeo-Christian God, but just for some God in general, is probably the question of how could something come from nothing generally. And it doesn't mean that that happened or that there was nothing or that something came from nothing, but there is a certain point where you can't explain it with an infinite regression of how the universe came to be. And even though we have the Big Bang, then you could say, okay, what caused that? What caused that? And I think that if you just define God as the first cause, I think that that works. But I don't think it's the kind of God that people worship. But I think that it's just as logical to say that that's what started it than if I said, what started it was out of nothing, something just appeared. So I think that they're the same level. I don't believe that. I personally don't know what happened, but I don't think it's illogical to say something must have happened. Let's call that thing or person a god by definition.
So, do you think there are any arguments then against that idea of like deism, or maybe that there is a God, there is a creator, but he just doesn't interfere with the universe?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably more of like deism, but I feel like deism, even, I feel like it has a big emphasis on God sets up the structure of how things work also. And I would say then you're kind of have to give it a little, give that thing that started it a lot of credit, and it's doing a lot of heavy lifting, where you're kind of saying, not only did it just set something off and then like it just so happened to be this universe, you also have to say that it had the intention to create this, or that it set up the processes, it set maybe the constants, the equations that physics seems to find so fundamental. So I think that that would be an issue. But then you also have the issue of, okay, if it wasn't a god or whatever you define God as, then what was it? And my answer is I don't know, truthfully, which I know is like it's hard to just say I don't know to some of the most fundamental questions and then question other people's beliefs, because it's kind of like they can't do it back to you if you just don't know. But I'd like to think that I'm not coming across as like your belief sucks, and it's more of I find holes in your belief. Can you explain it to me better?
Yeah. And of course, whenever you enter like a conversation, or a debate, I guess, you're going in with the mindset that, yeah, my belief may be changed. And
Hmm.
I guess you have to be okay with that. Now, you
Hmm.
mentioned earlier, like he set up like the equations and the constants. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I know you're really into physics and stuff. What do you think about using math to model the world? Do you think that that is, I guess, math at least is created um or is discovered, and to what extent can we say like, okay, there are three apples regardless of not humans are here, or we invented the number three to describe the physical world, and is math I guess separate from the real world? I'm curious
Hmm.
what you think.
So I think that even though it kind of seems like there's two ways you can answer it, I feel like there's three ways, or at least three ways of doing it. So the three options I could think of is one, math we just made up and it's how we use to describe the world. And the world it doesn't rely on any formulas. The other one would be that math is the language of the universe and it describes it perfectly, or maybe through experimentation we find physical constants and equations that that allow math to describe the world. But I think that the third option for that would be the world has some set mechanics and properties, and our math is based on what we know, tries to describe those mechanics and properties. But it could be like there's two different languages, whereas the universe is speaking like Spanish, if you will, and math is English. So we could get some things, and some things are going to be close. But there are some concepts in different languages that you just can't describe in English that maybe you could in Spanish. So it's something like that. And it's something could be like lost in translation. Like, unfortunately, again, I have to say, I don't know which of the three are true. But I think either way, there's definitely a lot of utility from using math to describe the world. So whether or not it will always work, we definitely see like our whole world, like since calculus was invented, everything just started to come together. Industrial revolution, everything.
Yeah, and I mean, some people believe that the any given structure, math, whatever, even the idea of like objects being like separate from other objects is just a human interpretation of a structureless world. Like for example, this like water bottle, right? There's no clear boundary between this water bottle. When do these atoms stop being the water bottle and start being the outside air? And consider that if there was no outside air, there's no air pressure holding the water bottle together, it would just collapse. So, and is the exterior of the water bottle different from the water bottle itself? Do you think that there's any like inherent structure to the universe, or is it more like just something that humans are interpreting, like separating
Yeah.
objects?
Mhm. I believe it's the second part. And I think that when it comes to something like this, even though I can't know which one's true, I think that in this case, and I know I've been saying that I don't know a lot. When I was saying I don't know, it's like I genuinely treat it like I don't know. In this case, I know logically, I know I shouldn't know what the answer is, but I do believe that it's true. Like if you held gun to my head and you asked me to stop believing that the world was just particles that we then put together in a collection to define it as a table, a water bottle, whatever, I couldn't change that belief. So I definitely believe that everything is whatever like the most fundamental particle is, whether it's a quark, an atom, a string from string theory, whatever that is. I believe that everything's just a series of lows. Let's use string theory, for instance. So everything is just a combination of strings, let's say vibrating in a certain way to create objects. And then we call objects different things for utility. And I think what you're, when you were talking, you reminded me of this question of the ship of Theseus, which just to quickly describe it is Theseus, who's a Greek hero. He has a ship, and the question posed is he goes into battle and one of the planks gets destroyed. So he replaces one of the planks and then he takes it back into battle. Another plank gets destroyed. He replaces it. And then that keeps happening until eventually all the planks are replaced. So the question is, there's a couple questions from it. The first question is that ship still the ship of Theseus, or is it a new ship? And if you say it's a new ship, at what point did it stop being the ship of Theseus? And then the other question as part of it is, if I took all of those planks from the original ship one by one, as I was taking it off, I put it off to the side, and I started creating a ship using those old pieces. And I put those two ships, the new ship with all the new pieces that were replaced one by one, and the old ship with all the old pieces that were added one by one. Which one is the ship of Theseus, if any? And so since I believe in like just the fundamental particles, I'm kind of obliged to say, well, it would be different the second you take one of the planks out, because it's a new collection of fundamental particles or strings. It's a new collection of whatever it is. And so I think that's probably a good argument against believing in, I believe that view is called mereological nihilism. It's probably a good argument against it, but at the same time, like I just can't really stop believing in it.
Mereological nihilism, from my understanding, is the belief that there are no simples, like there are no fundamental particles. But I could be wrong there. Someone may have to correct me. Is that what you're talking about, or the opposite?
I was talking like they're only the fundamental particles and then they interact in such a way, and we call like a collection of them, maybe we call it a hat, just because we don't want to say this particle, this particle, this particle, this particle, and they're in this form and they're interacting in this way. That's
But I
not
guess when
realistic.
when we talk about like added structure, I guess what I mean is that like does this water bottle exist as a collection of strings? Is there anything about this collection of particles that is that makes it distinct from the other like particles inherently in the way that they interact? I guess a certain subset of these interact a certain way because like they're made of certain molecules. But is there a way to distinguish between objects at the like molecular level?
I would say no, unless you probably would need like a pretty rigorous definition. I mean, of course, if you're saying anything that has one hydrogen and excuse me, two hydrogen and one oxygen arranged in this way with a covalent bond is water, then you don't really have a choice but to say that it is. But unless you have that definition, if I gave you all the particles from that water bottle and I said, if I like arrange it in all these different ways, is it a bottle? And I don't know. And then maybe you say like, it is if you arrange it in the way it looks right there. But if you make it like a sandwich with like water in the mid, water on, maybe even water as like the bread and like the plastic in the middle, you might say, no, it's not. And so like at what point is it a water bottle? I think that you have a really hard time answering that question. And so I would say that it's really just a construct in the mind where, from probably an evolutionary reason, we've developed, it's like been useful to identify a collection of stuff as a full thing. And then eventually, as language developed, we use that convention.
Do you think the argument for the ship of Theseus does it apply to like humans in terms of like we have some idea of self, right? And then as you progress like through your experience and your world, your self changes. So do you think that there's like a sense in which I am not a coherent person, or what is the self, I guess, to you? And how does the ship of Theseus, how do you interpret that under that lens?
Yeah. So I think that it's definitely a really hard question to answer. And I wrote an essay on it for the John Locke Institute competition. So it was on the question was like, what obligations do we owe to future persons that we don't owe to people living now? And which is an interesting question, and it's hard to say. And my answer was, or like, it was the question was like, what are the differences in obligations? And then what impact does that have on like government policy? And I essentially argued that there was no differences. And I actually used the ship of Theseus to help me argue for it. And I argued that since everyone is essentially this collection of particles that's constantly changing, me right now is a different me from me in a year. And then I would say at some point between then, I'm sure there's no definite point where a human would say, here's where the difference was. It's at this moment. But there is a difference. And so I essentially said that since we're new people, pretty much I said, like, since I believe in just the fundamental particles, I believe that it's very quickly because that's changing all the time. So even though there's a lot of consistency, I actually believe that we're changing all the time. So I argued that, and then I said, we have the same obligations because we are future people. And if we are future people, obviously we owe future people the same thing we owe ourselves.
And so I guess when we talk about the self, I guess we're using a certain model, right? Like we're using the model of we have like a certain personality, we have like a certain narrative about ourselves, right? And I feel that the like fundamental particles are somewhat distinct from that model and don't impact it, even though in reality that's what's happening. But those fundamental particles, like their interactions at any given moment, don't necessarily impact one's psychology, or, well, I mean, they might, I don't know. I don't know enough science to answer that question, and I don't know if anybody does. But do you think, I guess, under the model of like under a psychological lens, I guess, what do you think the self is?
Yeah. So I mean, it's hard to separate the two because, like you said, they're not mutually exclusive, and one does affect the another. And just to be clear, I don't think that those interactions are necessarily random. So I don't think that like the fundamental particles are like randomly going around and all of a sudden it creates a Micah Zarin or a Benjamin Davidson, and then all of a sudden the next second it's no longer similar. Like there's some reason why they're going around, and then evolutionarily by the process of survival of the fittest, natural selection, we're able to then control. I wouldn't like no, it's not a conscious thing, but by that mechanism, we're then able to create better fitted systems to help account for those. And so I would say from a psychological perspective, that's so hard to say what the self is.
Do you think there is a self?
Probably, probably not, honestly. I think that we definitely think and we see, and if we are the self, I feel like this is what like religious people typically call the soul, which I think if you believe in that, it's kind of like you do believe in the self, and it's the soul that's like connecting all the pieces of your body together. But I think that without something like that, I think that the problem is you can't tell where the soul or where the self starts and where it ends, because you could say like, oh, it's just your body, and then you could say, oh, well, your body's just connected by nerves to your brain. And then you go, oh, it's your brain. But then your brain has different functions everywhere. Is it your consciousness? I think that's probably the best answer would be consciousness, which I mean, we're not exactly sure where that came from, but it definitely is. And going back, I think that probably is also a good argument against atheism or agnosticism is like, why are we conscious?
What do you think consciousness is?
I think that for everyday language, it's pretty analogous to like awareness of the self, which I know is kind of like circular because I kind of described the self as consciousness. But I feel like that would be the best way to put it. And if I had a guess, and we don't know exactly where it came from, I would say that consciousness probably emerged from like evolutionary processes where we found that having not just like responding to stimuli, but I guess feeling stimuli on a deeper level enabled us to survive better. And I know that something like that, where it's from an evolutionary view, is a lot of scholars will argue for that. but nobody's in their right mind is able to say this is where consciousness comes from.
I mean, it could also be that it's a sort of like spandle, that it's just emergent from other processes that were evolutionary useful. Like people often ask, like, I think it's like, why do humans have chins? Because there's no evolutionary reason why we should have a chin. And it turns out that like if you have like a nose that's shaped like in a certain way and lips here and eyes here and your head is shaped a certain way, then just by like physics, you're forced to have like this sort of chin structure over here. So it's kind of like, in castles where you have like the three like pillars, and if you put them like this, or four, I mean, then there'll be like a little triangle in the middle, right? A little space in the middle.
Yeah.
That's called a spandle. So, do you think that consciousness could be like a spandle?
Um, I guess it could be. I guess it could be. It would seem kind of crazy for something that seems so big because it really is just what allows us to have a human experience. It would seem crazy if that was just like a side effect of trying to survive and it wasn't like at the very least it seems like it should be selected for a natural selection. And obviously, at the most, is like somebody chose you to be living and experiencing on Earth. But at the very least, it feels like it should be selected for. But I guess logically, that probably has just as good of an explanation.
Yeah, I mean, Douglas Hofstadter has a book called "I Am a Strange Loop," where he argues that consciousness is so like we model the world, right? There's obviously no like screen in our minds where like a picture is stored. Photons hit our eyes, and that causes neurons to fire to other neurons, and that like as it emerges from that, a picture emerges encoded as a representation in the
Hmm.
so he argues that consciousness is a similar process. It's that the brain, instead of modeling the world, is modeling its own internal processes. And so just as a result of um modeling, we model the world, right? And we model many things like from our sight, from our sound. One of the things that the brain models is itself. And it's sort of like a loop, like it's the brain modeling itself, which is modeling itself, which is modeling itself, which is modeling itself as like a
Hmm.
recursive loop. I don't know if that, what do you think about that?
I mean, that definitely it sounds reasonable, and I would say that it is it is answering like a slightly different question of like the why, like
Hmm.
why did it emerge? But I mean that sounds like a reasonable explanation for what is, but the problem is we can't really measure consciousness as much as we can measure its effects. So with that in mind, like you could really only get like philosophical arguments for what it is. We could look at brainwaves all we want, but we can't know, like for all we know, we could be conscious even after there are no brainwaves and we just don't know about it or so I think that like it's hard to tell and I think that like even if you look at like near death experiences where like scientifically the people are pretty close to dead and they still are experiencing moments that they remember. Now, what some people will use that to support like um, a god or but I think at the very least it's showing that consciousness is more complex than just some combination of random brain stuff because you would think that would be the first thing to shut off when your brain is trying to fight for its life because that seems so secondary.
Do you think, I guess, and we were talking, you said something interesting that we can't measure consciousness. We have, and so that, I guess that's the job of psychologists, right? Neuroscientists measure consciousness in some sense, and psychologists will measure the effects of consciousness. They'll talk to people and ask questions to sort of gauge one's internal state. And now what we start to see is with like AI models like ChatGPT, we start to see like AI psychologists. These are like the researchers, what they do, from my understanding, and I could be wrong, is they ask the AI certain questions to gauge its internal state. Do you think that idea has any merit, or have you seen anything about that? I mean, what do you think?
I mean, I think it's just always risky to compare AI to real life because at the end of the day, AI we know is just a system of like ones and zeros interacting. And that very well could be what's going on in our minds, just a system of like chemical reactions and mental processes and electrical impulses. But we know for AI that's all it is, but we don't know for ourselves if that's even a part of what consciousness is. So I do think that there's merit to asking AI those questions and finding out more about it so we can learn about AI. But I don't know how much that would apply to the human brain or human consciousness even.
Well, I mean, you said, or I guess I think something implicit was maybe consciousness is like an emergent property from those like nerve impulses and neurons talking to another other neurons. I guess how do we know that there's not a similar emergent property from neural networks in ones and zeros?
I mean, I guess we don't know, but I would I struggle to see why that would be, but I guess that would be a great mystery and we would never know because I mean, we see instances where the AI is like, "Don't shut me off, don't shut me off." And like, is there a chance that it could have developed some consciousness and said that? Sure, but I would think that nothing else is coming with it, and that it is just a series of ones and zeros. But I guess you're right that for all we know, just like our brain might just be consciousness might just be an emergent property from all the reactions going on. It could also be going on from AI. But I think the problem with that is then you could kind of have those what ifs for anything. What if it's an emergent property of this pencil, the way it's interacting together, it also happens to create a consciousness and it's thinking. Like, I don't think like, I feel like that sounds a lot very ridiculous. And sure, you could say, like, yeah, it could be, but I don't think it's fair to say the what if for that.
Yeah, there's this theory called I think it's integrated information theory, where the idea is like if a system is integrated enough, if it's recursive enough and talks to itself enough in a certain like integrated way, right? There's like a measure of this called like phi or something. If that like level of like recursion is high enough, then that thing is conscious. But the issue is, like you said, that could mean like a sufficiently integrated like electrical like wire system could be considered conscious. And I guess if you're looking like at brainwaves, if you're looking at MRIs from as like an alien, maybe there's no way that alien would know that we're conscious. The only reason we know of conscious is because we inhabit a human body. And I mean, I guess if we were AI and we were conscious, no one else would have a way of knowing because.
Yeah, and I would also further that, like, I don't even know if you're conscious. Like, I can only talk about my own personal experiences. It seems like you act in the same way that I do, that would, or at least enough to support that you're also a conscious body, and it's probably the same for animals. But I don't know. I don't know if I really don't know if you are. So I think you being one is just a result of it's probably useful for me to think that I'm not the only conscious body in the whole universe, because that would be pretty lonely, but it's just as possible for that to be the case as otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, solipsism, if we think of like Occam's razor, like the belief that requires the fewest additional assumptions based off like the information we have is the one that's likeliest to be true. Does that apply to solipsism? Like the belief that you're the only conscious person on Earth? Or does it apply against it? Like, is it an additional assumption that I'm conscious? Or is it an additional assumption that I'm not conscious? Razor.
I mean, I'm not sure, honestly. I would say it's probably an additional assumption either way, which means that it's probably not applicable. If I had to be honest, that's probably the case.
Interesting. Do you believe that these like when you think of like razors, right? Do you
Mhm.
think that there's anything like there's any inherent reason why or whenever we choose like axioms for anything, like Kant's what is it called? Like universability, like where you if you know what I'm talking about?
No.
It's like the way we establish moral principles is if everybody followed a certain moral principle, like what would be the result? So like for example, like, if I say murder is good, right? And everybody goes out murdering people, the result would not be favorable. Do you think that there's anything inherently true about these like axioms that we make? And also, what is your opinion on like ethics? Like, do you think that there are moral statements? that are true or false? Do you think moral statements have like true false values or?
So to respond to your first question, I don't think that I would assume that it's kind of like nature and nurture are driving our reasons for these like axiomatic beliefs that are like so fundamental to our systems of ethics. And I think that if you look at was it utilitarianism in chapter 4 of the book from Mills, I think it's called, I might be misquoting it. It's like, of what sorts of proofs is utilitarianism susceptible to? It's not called proofs of utilitarianism because you can't be able to prove it. There's no way to. So I think that probably all of those systems are going to be susceptible to that. But whether that applies or not to like the fundamental theories or like the axioms of it, I don't know if that's true. And then for your second part, I don't think that there exists any true false statements in morals. I subscribe to a view known as emotivism. And it's essentially if I say like murder is good, or let's not say that. If I say something like eating is good, that's analogous to me saying like yay eating. Or if I say like murder is bad, that's analogous to me saying like boo murder. Like it's not establishing something as true.
True.
Yeah. And I don't think that you could have moral claims as true or false. The biggest reason for that is I think it's David Hume. He said you can't derive an ought from an is. And so if I say, um, even if I say murder is bad, I can't then derive you ought to not murder. So even for something as fundamental as that, and in general, you can never do that. So I think that whenever every ethical system, or at least most of them, will rely on at least one ought, you, at the very least, you ought to do that which is good, or you ought to do that which is in God's best interest. Whatever that is, it all relies on at least one of those fundamental axioms or fundamental oughts, which I think is a problem for all of them. Whereas like emotivism doesn't rely on that because you're not making any true or false claims. I can't say, when I say anything, even if it appears that I'm saying like, you ought to not do it, I can't say that in emotivism.
Do you think that I mean, have you ever like talked to someone about ethics? How are you able to do that with your belief in mind?
So I think that we need to account for the reason why we have ethics. And I don't think that it's to describe a true reason to do something. And if you look at like prison systems, for instance, we don't have them in place. Like with my, like if you believe in free will or if you don't, if somebody's committed murder 5 times, you don't want them on the streets, not because you're logically sure that they're going to do it again. But you don't want them there because there's a very good chance that they will. And you know that murder will cause more of an unstable society, and that's why you put them in jail. So I believe that like, and also you have like you can't really say murder is bad, but you could say that it's useful for a society to not have murder in it. And I think that something like that, even though that's probably that's definitely not like a provable statement, it's generally an accepted upon statement, which then allows you to build. So I think that I differ from that belief when I come to discussing like laws or politics. And I kind of will like, I will adopt whatever like the common axiomatic statements might be. And one of which is like, you ought to do that, which is good. And then we can debate what's good or not. But I think that's a pretty fair one for people to adopt.
Do you believe in free will?
I do not, but at the same time, I feel like I can make my own choices. So, which is very contradictory since, like I said, I really only believe in like the fundamental particles controlling stuff. You can't make a conscious decision because you are not a full thing because you're just a collection of particles or a collection of strings or whatever. So, since I believe in that, like you can't really have free will in that, but at the same time, I really do feel like I could do whatever decision I want.
Maybe the fact that you feel that way is a result of evolution. Like um my understanding is that from like neuroscience and whatnot, whenever we make a decision, our brain has already decided what we're going to do about like 140 milliseconds before as a result of like we learned this in I think Lamont's experiments. But when we feel we're going to say, let's say I decide to punch you in the face, right? Like that decision and me feeling that I'm making that decision, my brain has already made the decision. I'm just feeling what it feels like for my brain to, I guess, model going through the different, decisions, which is heavily influenced by, how hungry am I? Um, what events have happened to me in the past week? Am I stressed out? Whatever. It's just a model. And I guess that goes back to what we were saying earlier about how consciousness may just be our brain modeling itself. Free will, the experience of free will, could just be our brain modeling its own decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess free will, if you just say it's an experience, that probably works because it is some because I guess for me it's really just a feeling, or at least it's closest to a feeling from the words that like we have at our disposals, as opposed to like a truth.
Yeah, and I mean, like, we can't imagine what it'd be like to not have that feeling because it's like not, you can't imagine what it'd be like to have like three arms. I was
Hmm.
talking to somebody the other day, um, about something similar and how like certain people aren't able to think abstractly in certain senses. So like if you ask them like what does it mean like the early bird gets the worm?
If you show up somewhere early, you're gonna get, or if you wake up early and you put in the work, you're gonna get the results.
Yeah, so like if you ask some people that they'll just say because the bird will eat the worm.
Mhm.
And I guess even when for certain like children, they're not able to think abstractly because they haven't developed that yet. And so if you ask them a question like that, if you ask them to think abstractly, I guess they don't have that option. And I wonder how that feels. How do you think that feels?
I mean, I don't know. I think that there's a trend on the internet for a little, um, where it's like while you're videoing your baby, you post them having like their first when they realize that they had consciousness. So it's like, and then you wonder like what happened before that. I mean, nobody remembers anything from when they were a baby or the
Yeah.
day that they were born.
Actually, I do.
Okay, I'm sure. Um, because of that, like I really wonder what was going on before that. Like, was there anything? Well, like as far as I believe, like you're still having memories, but I guess maybe it's not fully developed yet, or I'm sure there's some psychological reason why we don't remember anything from that.
Yeah, and I mean, we have certain beliefs that we acquire, like I know who my mom is, right? And I
Mhm,
learned that when I was a baby, but I don't remember learning that. Just like I don't remember learning, what 2 + 2 = 4 is, or I don't remember the first time I saw my mom, yet I know who my mom is through
mhm,
repeated exposure.
yeah,
Okay. Do you have any final one last thing I want to discuss?
yeah, go
What do
for
you
it.
do you think the world is broken? And what do you think it means for what do you think that means for like Gen Z?
I don't think the world is broken. I believe that, and we definitely see it a lot, that things tend to go in this pendulum cycle with everything, where it's like, even if it's like going hard on crime and you go really hard, and then people are like, okay, why are you going so hard on it? Like, there's no need to give somebody like 5 years for like petty theft. And like the pendulum like swings back and it goes up to like now you're loose on crime. Now maybe you're not even prosecuting petty theft, and then it swings back and then you keep going and it keeps going back and forth. So I don't know where we're at in that cycle, but I think that the cycle will keep going on. And I think that it's definitely unfortunate for Gen Z to be growing up in a time where we're able to see all this violence, whether it's political, religious, or even just general violence going on. And we're being accustomed to it at such a young age. So I hope that's not gonna be a problem and it really doesn't leave this, like, lasting impact on us, but I do know that eventually things will shift back, even if it's not the same as it won't be the same as it was before, and maybe it'll be better, maybe it'll be worse, who knows, but it'll definitely shift back.
That's life.
Mhm.
I think this is a great place to stop.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.